2,500 years ago, one man looked at the known world and decided it wasn't big enough. Within a single generation, an empire exploded across 3 continents, from the sun-scorched valleys of the Nile to the icy peaks of the Hindu Kush, from the Aegean coastline to the deserts of Central Asia. It was bigger than anything humanity had ever built. It ruled over more people, more languages, more religions, and more cultures than any state before it, nearly half the population of the entire planet at the time. This was not Rome. Rome was still a muddy village of shepherds when this empire ruled the earth. This was Persia, and its story begins not with a conqueror's cruelty, but with an act of mercy that changed the rules of empire forever. The story of the first superpower does not begin with armies. It begins with a boy raised in the rugged hill country of Anshan, a minor vassal kingdom tucked into the folds of the Zagros Mountains in what is now southern Iran. His name was Kurush, the Greeks would later call him Cyrus, and in the middle of the 6th century BCE, nothing about his birth suggested he would become the architect of the largest empire the world had yet seen. At that time, the political map of the Near East was dominated by older, more established powers. To the north and west lay the Median Empire, a confederation of Iranian-speaking peoples who had already helped destroy the once invincible Assyrian Empire decades earlier. The Medes were, technically, the overlords of the Persians. Cyrus's own father, Cambyses I, ruled Anshan as a vassal king, paying tribute and deference to the Median throne, then held by Astyages. Further west sat the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendarily rich Croesus, whose capital at Sardis controlled lucrative trade routes and Aegean coastal cities. To the south, along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Neo-Babylonian Empire held court in the ancient and magnificent city of Babylon, having inherited the mantle of Mesopotamian power after the fall of Assyria. And further southwest, Egypt endured under its native Sate pharaohs, still proud of a civilization already ancient by this point. Into this world of established, competing powers, Cyrus began his ascent around 559 BCE, when he became king of Persia. Herodotus, writing a century later, wrapped Cyrus's early life in the language of myth, a grandfather's ominous dream, an infant left to die on a mountainside, a loyal herdsman who raised him in secret. These are the classic ingredients of a hero's origin story, echoed across many ancient cultures, and modern historians treat them with appropriate skepticism. What is more historically grounded is what came next, Cyrus's rebellion against his Median overlord. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus rose against Astyages. The war was not a simple case of a plucky vassal defeating a mighty empire through sheer will. Ancient sources suggest that a Median general named Harpagus, who nursed a personal grievance against Astyages, defected to Cyrus's side during the conflict, tipping the balance of power. When the dust settled, Cyrus had not merely won independence for Persia, he had inherited the entire Median Empire, absorbing its territory, its administrative structure, and crucially, its army. This is a detail worth pausing on, because it reveals something essential about how Cyrus would build his empire. Rather than simply crushing his enemies, he frequently incorporated them, folding their institutions and manpower into his growing state. The Medes did not vanish from history, they became partners in the new Persian order, and for the rest of the empire's existence, Greek writers would often refer to the Persians and Medes almost interchangeably, a linguistic fossil of this early fusion. With Media absorbed, Cyrus now commanded a vastly expanded realm, and his ambitions did not pause. His next target was Lydia, whose king, Croesus, is remembered by history largely for his fabulous wealth, the origin of the phrase, rich as Croesus. According to Herodotus, Croesus, alarmed by Cyrus's growing power, consulted the oracle at Delphi about whether he should attack Persia. The oracle famously told him that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus, interpreting this as a favorable omen, marched to war. The great empire he destroyed turned out to be his own. The campaign culminated around 547 BCE at the Battle of Thymbra, where Cyrus's forces, in a bold and unconventional maneuver, reportedly used camels to unsettle the Lydian cavalry's horses, which were unaccustomed to the animal scent. Lydia fell, its capital Sardis was captured, and the wealthy Greek city-states along the Ionian coast, which had been Lydian vassals, now found themselves under Persian control instead, a transition of power that would, generations later, help spark the Greco-Persian Wars. The conquest of Lydia extended Persian authority all the way to the Aegean Sea. An extraordinary achievement for a kingdom that, only a decade earlier, had been a tributary state. But the most consequential conquest still lay ahead: Babylon. By the 540s BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, though militarily and economically formidable, was politically fragile. Its king, Nabonidus, was a deeply unusual ruler by Mesopotamian standards. He had spent years away from the capital, residing in the Arabian oasis of Tama, and had promoted the worship of the moon god Sin above Babylon's traditional patron deity, Marduk. This religious reorientation alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk and much of the Babylonian elite, who saw Nabonidus as neglecting sacred tradition. When Cyrus's armies approached in 539 BCE, this internal discontent proved decisive. According to Babylonian sources, including the famous Cyrus Cylinder, Persian forces entered Babylon with minimal resistance, and Cyrus was welcomed by segments of the population and priesthood as a legitimate restorer of order rather than a foreign invader. Whether this was purely genuine sentiment or effective Persian propaganda inscribed after the fact remains a subject of scholarly debate, but the practical outcome was clear: one of the ancient world's greatest cities changed hands with remarkably little bloodshed. What Cyrus did next would define his legacy for millennia. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay artifact inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform and discovered in the 19th century, records Cyrus's policies following the conquest. He claims to have ended oppressive practices, restored displaced peoples to their homelands, and permitted the rebuilding of temples that had been neglected or destroyed. Among the peoples affected were the Judean exiles, who had been forcibly relocated to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar 2 decades earlier following the destruction of Jerusalem. The Hebrew Bible, in the Book of Ezra, credits Cyrus with issuing a decree permitting the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, an act that secured him a uniquely positive reputation in Jewish tradition, where he is referred to by the extraordinary title of Messiah, or Anointed One, the only non-Israelite in the Hebrew Bible to receive such a designation. Historians today generally view this policy not simply as altruism, but as a sophisticated and pragmatic approach to imperial governance. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Persian culture, language, or religion across his conquered territories, an approach that had often bred rebellion in earlier empires like Assyria, Cyrus pursued a strategy of relative tolerance, allowing local elites, customs, and religious practices to continue largely undisturbed, provided that tribute was paid and Persian political authority was respected. This was not democracy, and it was certainly not without coercion. Cyrus's empire was built and maintained through military force, and rebellion was met with serious consequences. But compared to the often brutal deportation policies of the Assyrians, Cyrus's model represented something genuinely distinctive in the ancient world, an empire that governed diversity rather than attempting to erase it. By the time of his death, Cyrus had built an empire stretching from Anatolia in the west to the borders of India in the east, encompassing Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Iranian plateau. He died around 530 BCE, according to most ancient accounts, during a military campaign in Central Asia against nomadic peoples, though the precise circumstances remain debated among historians, with different ancient sources offering conflicting narratives about his final battle. He was buried at Pasargadae, in a tomb whose simple, dignified architecture still stands today, a limestone structure of restrained elegance, reflecting perhaps the same pragmatic character that had built his empire. Alexander the Great, centuries later, would visit this tomb and reportedly weep, moved by the transience of even the greatest human achievements. Cyrus had built the foundation. It would now fall to his successors to determine whether this new kind of empire could survive contact with its own scale. Cyrus the Great died leaving behind an empire of staggering scale but uncertain permanence. The great question facing any conqueror's successors is always the same: can the empire outlive the individual brilliance that created it? For Persia, this question would be answered, often violently, over the next several decades, culminating in the reign of a ruler who would transform Cyrus's conquest state into something more enduring, a genuine system of governance. Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, inherited the throne around 530 BCE. Cambyses is remembered primarily for one extraordinary achievement, the conquest of Egypt. In 525 BCE, Persian forces defeated the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, bringing the ancient civilization of the pharaohs under Persian rule and adding immense wealth and prestige to the empire. Egyptian sources from the period, including inscriptions from officials who served under Persian rule, suggest that Cambyses, at least initially, attempted to present himself within traditional pharaonic religious and political frameworks, adopting Egyptian royal titulature, a continuation of the pattern of cultural accommodation established by his father. Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, paint a far more negative portrait of Cambyses' time in Egypt, describing acts of sacrilege against Egyptian religious practices and portraying him as increasingly unstable. Modern historians treat these accounts with considerable caution, noting that Herodotus wrote generations later, relied on Egyptian informants who may have had reasons to portray the foreign conqueror unfavorably, and that some claims, such as the killing of the sacred Apis bull, are difficult to verify and possibly exaggerated or invented. Cambyses' reign ended in crisis. While campaigning or returning from Egypt in 522 BCE, he died under circumstances that remain genuinely disputed among historians. Ancient sources mention an accidental wound from his own sword, though the exact truth is unrecoverable given the fragmentary and politically motivated nature of surviving accounts. What followed was a succession crisis of the first order. A man named Gaumata, according to the Persian king who would soon seize power, claimed the throne by impersonating Cambyses' brother Bardia, who had allegedly been secretly murdered earlier. Whether this was truly an impostor or whether this narrative was itself a later invention designed to legitimize a usurpation remains one of the most debated puzzles in ancient Persian historiography, since our primary source for these events was composed by the very man who benefited from overthrowing the supposed impostor. That man was Darius I, a member of a collateral branch of the Achaemenid royal family, who in 522 BCE led a group of conspirators to kill the pretender and seize the throne for himself. Darius's own account of these events, monumentally carved into a cliff face at Behistun in western Iran, describes a nearly 2-year campaign to suppress a wave of rebellions that erupted across the empire following his seizure of power, uprisings in Babylon, Media, Elam, Persia itself, and other regions, as various claimants and rebels sought to exploit the chaos of contested succession. The Behistun inscription, carved in three languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, represents one of the most important sources for understanding early Achaemenid history, though historians rightly treat it as a piece of royal propaganda designed to legitimize Darius's rule, not a neutral historical record. Its trilingual text would later prove instrumental to 19th-century scholars in deciphering cuneiform script, making it not just a historical source but a genuine milestone in the modern recovery of ancient Near Eastern history. Having secured his throne through what was essentially a civil war, Darius turned to the task that would define his legacy, transforming a loosely bound conquest empire into a coherent, administratively sophisticated state. This is where Darius's genius truly lay, not on the battlefield, but in the machinery of governance. Darius divided the empire into administrative provinces known as satrapies. Each governed by an official called a satrap, typically a Persian nobleman or, occasionally, a trusted local elite, who managed regional affairs, collected tribute, and maintained order on behalf of the central crown. Herodotus records roughly 20 satrapies, each assigned a specific tribute obligation calibrated to its economic capacity, paid in silver, gold, or in-kind goods depending on the region. Importantly, Darius established checks on satrapal power. Royal inspectors, sometimes called the king's eyes and ears, traveled the empire to monitor satraps and report signs of corruption or disloyalty directly back to the crown, a mechanism designed to prevent regional governors from accumulating enough independent power to challenge central authority. To bind this vast territory together physically, Darius invested heavily in infrastructure. The most famous example is the Royal Road, stretching approximately 1,600 miles from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Persia, one of the empire's key administrative capitals. Way stations were positioned along its length, providing fresh horses and supplies for royal messengers, allowing information and directives to travel across the empire with a speed that astonished contemporary observers. Herodotus's famous description of Persian messengers being undeterred by snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, would centuries later inspire the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service. Darius also standardized currency, introducing the gold daric and silver siglos coins, and promoted the use of Aramaic as an administrative lingua franca across the empire's diverse linguistic landscape, allowing officials from Egypt to Bactria to communicate through a shared bureaucratic language even while local populations continued speaking their own tongues. Darius also expanded the empire's borders further, pushing into the Indus Valley region in the east and, more consequentially for later history, into Europe. Around 513 BCE, he led a campaign north of the Danube against Scythian nomads, an expedition that achieved limited lasting success but demonstrated Persian ambitions extending into the European continent. Far more significant, however, were Darius's dealings with the Greek world, dealings that would eventually draw Persia into one of the most consequential conflicts in ancient history. In 499 BCE, several Ionian Greek cities along the Aegean coast, under Persian rule since Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, rose in revolt against Persian authority, an uprising known as the Ionian Revolt. The mainland Greek city-state of Athens sent a modest contingent of ships to assist the rebels, an act of support that, while militarily minor, earned Athens the lasting enmity of the Persian crown once the revolt was eventually crushed around 494 BCE. According to Herodotus, Darius was so incensed by Athenian involvement that he reportedly ordered a servant to remind him 3 times daily, "Remember the Athenians," ensuring he would not forget to eventually punish the city for its interference. This grievance set the stage for Persia's first major invasion of Greece. In 490 BCE, a Persian expeditionary force landed at Marathon, a plain northeast of Athens, intending to punish the city and reassert Persian dominance over the Greek mainland. What followed was one of the most celebrated battles in Western military history. The outnumbered Athenian hoplites, employing a bold tactical formation that thinned their center while reinforcing their flanks, routed the Persian forces in a decisive engagement, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing a Persian withdrawal. The Battle of Marathon became legendary in Greek memory, not only as a military triumph but as a foundational moment in Athenian civic identity, and the story of the messenger who supposedly ran to Athens to announce victory before collapsing dead gave rise to the modern marathon race, even though most historians regard the specific running legend as a later embellishment rather than a strictly factual account. For Darius, Marathon was a humiliating setback but not a fatal one. The vast Persian Empire had suffered a single defeat at its western periphery. Hardly a mortal wound to a state stretching thousands of miles to the east. Darius began preparing a larger invasion to avenge the defeat, but he died in 486 BCE before this campaign could be launched, leaving the unfinished business of Greece, and the vast, complex empire he had spent decades organizing, to his son and successor, Xerxes. Xerxes I ascended to the Persian throne in 486 BCE, inheriting not only an empire of extraordinary size but also his father's unfinished vendetta against the Greek mainland. Before he could turn his attention westward, however, Xerxes first had to deal with rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, suppressing both with characteristic Achaemenid firmness, in the process reportedly removing some of the special privileges Babylon had previously enjoyed, according to later Greek accounts, though the precise details and extent of this punishment remain debated among modern historians working from fragmentary Babylonian administrative records. With internal order restored, Xerxes committed to the invasion of Greece on a scale that dwarfed his father's earlier expedition. Herodotus, our primary narrative source, describes years of methodical preparation, the construction of a canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula to allow the Persian fleet to avoid the treacherous waters where a previous invasion fleet had been wrecked by storms, and the building of an extraordinary pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, constructed from lashed-together ships to allow the massive Persian army to cross into Europe on foot. Herodotus's figures for the size of Xerxes' invasion force, reportedly over 1 million men, are almost universally rejected by modern historians as wildly exaggerated, a common feature of ancient battle narratives meant to heighten the drama of the underdog Greek resistance. Contemporary scholarly estimates suggest a force more realistically in the range of several tens to perhaps low hundreds of thousands. Still an enormous logistical undertaking for the ancient world, but far more plausible. Given the practical challenges of supplying and moving such an army. In 480 BCE, this invasion force pushed south into Greece. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, a small allied Greek force, most famously remembered for its contingent of 300 Spartan warriors under King Leonidas, though the actual coalition included several thousand troops from multiple Greek city-states, made a defensive stand intended to delay the Persian advance. For roughly 2 days, the vastly outnumbered Greek force held the narrow pass, exploiting the terrain to negate the Persian numerical advantage, until a local resident named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed Persian forces to outflank the defenders. Recognizing the position was lost, Leonidas reportedly dismissed most of the allied army, remaining behind with his Spartans and a small contingent of others to fight a final delaying action, in which nearly all the defenders were killed. Though a tactical defeat, Thermopylae bought crucial time for Greek forces elsewhere and became, almost immediately, a powerful symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, a reputation it retains to this day. With the pass at Thermopylae cleared, Persian forces advanced into Attica and captured Athens itself, which had been evacuated by its population beforehand, and burned the city, including its temples on the Acropolis, an act of destruction that Athenian sources would long remember as a particular atrocity. However, the naval and political situation was shifting against Persia. The Athenian statesman Themistocles had convinced his fellow citizens to invest heavily in a large war fleet in the years prior, ostensibly to deal with a regional rivalry with the island of Aegina, but this fleet now formed the core of Greek naval resistance to Persia. In September 480 BCE, the combined Greek fleet met the much larger Persian navy in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. The confined waters neutralized the Persian numerical advantage and allowed Greek ships to fight more effectively, and the battle ended in a decisive Greek naval victory. Xerxes, who reportedly watched the battle from a hillside throne overlooking the strait, was forced to reconsider the entire campaign's viability, given that his fleet, which had been essential to supplying his massive land army, was now severely weakened. Xerxes returned to Persia following Salamis, leaving a substantial portion of his army under the general Mardonius to continue the campaign the following year. In 479 BCE, this remaining force was decisively defeated by a combined Greek army at the Battle of Plataea, effectively ending the immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece. Around the same time, Greek naval forces reportedly won another engagement at Mycale on the Ionian coast, further weakening the remaining Persian position in the Aegean region. Together, these defeats marked the practical end of Xerxes' invasion, though sporadic conflict and skirmishing between Persia and various Greek states, particularly through the Athenian-led Delian League, would continue intermittently for decades afterward. It is worth pausing here to place these dramatic and historically famous battles within their proper context relative to the Persian Empire as a whole. From the perspective of Greek history, the Greco-Persian Wars represent an existential struggle, and understandably so, given what was at stake for Greek independence and the subsequent flourishing of Athenian democracy and classical Greek culture. From the perspective of the Persian Empire, however, these conflicts, however costly and embarrassing, occurred at the extreme western fringe of an empire that still comfortably controlled the vast majority of the ancient Near East, from Egypt through Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. The failure to conquer mainland Greece did not meaningfully threaten the core stability or wealth of the Achaemenid state, even though it looms enormously large in the historical narrative, largely because so much of our surviving detailed narrative history comes from Greek authors like Herodotus, whose focus was naturally centered on their own civilization's struggle for survival. Xerxes' later reign, after the Greek campaigns, is comparatively less well documented in detail, though he is credited with continuing significant building projects at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital his father had begun constructing, adding grand structures including the Hall of 100 Columns. Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BCE in a palace conspiracy, an event that, like several succession crises in Achaemenid history, involved competing court factions and remains only partially clear in its precise details due to the fragmentary and sometimes contradictory nature of surviving sources. His son Artaxerxes I succeeded him, beginning a new phase of Achaemenid rule characterized less by dramatic territorial expansion and more by the ongoing challenge of managing an already vast and diverse empire, alongside continued, if reduced, friction with the Greek world. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, the dramatic conquests and existential battles that had defined Persia's first century were giving way to a longer, quieter, and in some ways more remarkable story, the sheer administrative and cultural achievement of holding together the largest empire the world had yet known. It is worth stepping back from the chronology of kings and battles to appreciate what the Achaemenid Persian Empire actually was as a functioning system, because this, more than any single battle, represents its most enduring historical significance. At its height under Darius I and his successors, the Achaemenid Empire stretched across an estimated 2 million square miles, encompassing territory that today spans more than 20 modern nations, from Libya and Egypt in the west to Pakistan and parts of Central Asia in the east. Estimates of the empire's total population vary considerably among historians due to the difficulty of ancient demographic reconstruction, but many scholars place the figure somewhere between 20 and 50 million people, at a time when total world population is estimated to have been in the range of perhaps 100 to 150 million, meaning the Persian Empire may plausibly have governed something approaching a quarter to a third of all humanity alive at the time, an almost unprecedented concentration of political authority in a single state. Governing such staggering diversity required genuine institutional innovation. The Achaemenid court developed a sophisticated administrative bureaucracy centered on major capitals, including Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, and Ecbatana, between which the royal court itself often moved seasonally, a practice that allowed the king's presence and authority to be felt across different regions of the empire throughout the year rather than remaining static in a single location. Archaeological discoveries at Persepolis, particularly a substantial cache of administrative tablets known as the Persepolis Fortification Archive, have provided modern historians with extraordinarily detailed insight into the mundane realities of imperial administration. Records of rations distributed to travelers and workers, wages paid to laborers of many different ethnicities and even genders working on royal building projects, and the movement of goods and officials across the empire's vast territory. These humble bureaucratic records, in many ways, tell us more about the practical functioning of the empire than the grand royal inscriptions do, revealing a state that managed complex logistics of labor, supply, and travel across enormous distances with considerable sophistication. Religiously, the Achaemenid court was closely associated with Zoroastrianism, a faith centered on the teachings attributed to the prophet Zoroaster, emphasizing a cosmic struggle between the forces of truth and order, associated with the deity Ahura Mazda, and the forces of falsehood and chaos. Royal inscriptions, particularly those of Darius, invoke Ahura Mazda prominently as the source of royal legitimacy. However, the precise nature and extent of Zoroastrian religious practice at the imperial level, versus its role as a more diffuse cultural and cosmological framework, remains a subject of ongoing academic debate, since surviving evidence does not clearly indicate that the Achaemenid kings sought to impose Zoroastrian religious practice on their subject populations in the way some later empires would attempt religious uniformity. Consistent with the pattern established by Cyrus in Babylon, the empire generally permitted subject peoples to maintain their own religious traditions, a policy of relative pluralism that stands in notable contrast to some other ancient and even later historical empires. Economically, the empire facilitated trade and exchange across an enormous geographic range, standardizing coinage in some regions while permitting continued local economic practices in others, and its network of roads, way stations, and administrative communication allowed goods, ideas, and people to move across Eurasia with a facility that would not be matched again in that region until much later historical periods. Aramaic served as a practical administrative lingua franca, used by officials communicating across the empire's bewildering diversity of local languages, from Egyptian hieroglyphic and demotic scripts to Elamite, Akkadian, and various Iranian and Anatolian languages, while Old Persian, written in a specially adapted cuneiform script primarily for royal inscriptions, served more as a symbolic marker of dynastic authority than a widely used practical administrative language. The later Achaemenid period, from the reign of Artaxerxes I through the 4th century BCE, is often characterized by historians as an era of relative internal stability punctuated by periodic succession disputes, provincial rebellions, and continued complex diplomatic and military engagement with the Greek world, including notable episodes such as Persian financial support for various Greek city-states during their own internal conflicts, most significantly the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, in which Persian gold played a meaningful role in eventually tipping the balance towards Sparta. This reflects a broader Achaemenid strategic pattern. Rather than always seeking direct military conquest, later Persian kings frequently employed diplomacy, subsidies, and the strategic exploitation of Greek internal rivalries to protect Persian interests and limit Greek unity, a subtler but often highly effective tool of statecraft. This long era of Achaemenid power finally came to an end in the 4th century BCE, brought down not by internal collapse but by external conquest. Alexander III of Macedon, having unified Greece under Macedonian hegemony following his father Philip II's earlier campaigns, launched an invasion of the Persian Empire beginning in 334 BCE. Over the following decade, Alexander's forces won a series of decisive battles against the last great Achaemenid king, Darius III, including major engagements at Issus in 333 BCE and Gaugamela in 331 BCE, ultimately conquering the entirety of the Persian heartland, including the ceremonial capital of Persepolis, which was destroyed by fire during Alexander's occupation under circumstances that remain debated among historians, with some ancient sources suggesting it was a deliberate act of retribution for Xerxes' earlier burning of Athens, while others suggest a more accidental or drunken incident. Darius III himself was killed in 330 BCE by his own satrap Bessus, who attempted unsuccessfully to continue resistance before being captured and executed by Alexander. With Darius III's death, the nearly 2¼ century-long Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire founded by Cyrus the Great, expanded by Darius I, and nearly broken by its wars with Greece, finally came to an end. Yet its influence did not vanish with its conquest. Alexander himself, and the Hellenistic successor kingdoms that emerged after his death, adopted many elements of Persian administrative practice, court ceremony, and governance, recognizing the sophistication of the system they had inherited. The Achaemenid model of governing vast, diverse territories through a combination of centralized authority, delegated regional administration, religious tolerance, and infrastructural investment would echo forward through subsequent empires across the region for centuries, from the later Parthian and Sasanian Persian empires to, arguably, aspects of Roman provincial administration in the eastern Mediterranean. The first superpower had fallen, but the template it created for ruling a genuinely multicultural world empire had permanently changed the course of human political history.